Next, going to introduce to you Sean Murphy from Norton Rose Fulbright. He is the legal chair of the Smart Contracts Alliance, and he'll be moderating our next panel, Code is Law.
Ground that we're going to cover. I'm very lucky to have a fantastic panel of panelists and experts here to discuss this with us. In a moment, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. What I will say, though, is that we would like this to be as interactive as possible. We will leave time at the end for questions, but if anybody has a question during the course of this, please just raise your hand. We'll take the questions as they come. Please don't wait to the end if you've got a burning question. So let's kick off. I think what we'll do, if we go down the line, if everyone could introduce themselves and explain while you're doing that what your interest in DLT is and smart contracts in particular.
Sure. Hi, so my name is Dax Hansen. I'm a partner in the Seattle office of Perkins Coie. I'm a technology lawyer and a financial services lawyer. I chair the firm's fintech and blockchain industry practice groups. We've been down in the trenches, so to speak, since 2011, as we've helped a number of the companies develop either cryptocurrency technology solutions or blockchain distributed ledger solutions, and have been approaching it from both the financial services side, the capital market side, and technology generally, since digital ledger technology can impact really every industry, every vertical.
Hi everyone, I'm Kavita Jain. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a technologist, so probably a bit of an oddball here. I'm with the Office of Emerging Regulatory Issues at FINRA. FINRA is the regulator of the securities industry. We've been engaging in an active dialogue with the industry for the past year and a half. We've talked to several market participants, broker-dealers, banks, just really trying to understand the various applications of blockchain technology and smart contracts, really with our regulatory framework. As I was talking to my panelists earlier, we talked about how DLT and smart contracts really creates a new paradigm, and we're engaging in dialogue with the industry to understand how this new paradigm will fit within the regulatory framework. So I'm excited to be here today.
Hello, everyone. Sandra Rowe. I lead our digitization efforts at CME Group. You will hopefully be aware that I'm actually not a lawyer, and I'm not a regulator, so I'm the real oddball in this panel. But as an industry participant, especially as a large market infrastructure firm, we very much care about the evolution of not only blockchain, but smart contracts. And we've just begun to scratch the surface of trying to understand the implications of this technology and the applications on our business today, and more importantly, on our business tomorrow. So that's my interest.
Hi, Sayee, Srinivasan. I'm the Chief Economist at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. If there was a smart contract for this event, it'll say something here that whatever I say are my views and not that of the Commission or the staff of the Commission. For an economist to be worrying about smart contracts and blockchain and so on and so forth, I was thinking my economics professors will be turning in the grave, because a lot of commerce should be sort of the core principles of economics should be agnostic about technology. But we all live in the real world, so we sort of need to deal with this. At the CFTC itself, we have been quite engaged in the emerging technologies. The initial interest about a couple of years ago was on Bitcoins. And there was an industry, a roundtable discussion where the topic was Bitcoin, but pretty quickly the conversation moved to distributed ledgers. And I remember sitting at the back and just busy on my BlackBerry, because yeah, Bitcoins is all fun, but we were all focused on other stuff. But the moment the conversation shifted to distributed ledgers, we all woke up. And from that point on, we all were really interested in this whole evolution. Within CFTC itself, we have small agency, lots of very interesting responsibilities, but we have an interdivisional working group with people staff from all the different divisions, and dedicated to keeping track of what's happening in this in this evolutionary process. Bitcoins, blockchains, and maybe the outsider should say, anytime anybody wants to come and talk to us, you should feel free to reach out to us. And we have people who are sort of mining blockchain and things like that. So.
Okay, so what I'd like to do before we sort of dive into the legal and regulatory questions, I want to ask a scene-setting question. We heard in the earlier panel some definitions of smart contracts, and we heard discussion about how they fit into the broader DLT landscape. I'd like to ask this panel that question. So what are smart contracts and how do they fit into the DLT landscape?
So I'll take a crack. And I was raising my hand. Eric would never call on me, but I was trying to suggest that next time we have the legal and regulatory folks and the technologists on the same panel when we're trying to define these things. And so a welcome participation from the tech panelists in the audience. But what I heard actually was a surprising amount of diversity in terms of definitions on this first panel. And to me, it's really nice to have this setting for people to voice their opinions and their views and their definitions about what is a smart contract. For me, the words I kept hearing were applications, distributed applications that execute. And so what I understand generally is that this is a transaction that it's software code that can execute, that it is automatable and can be enforceable, that is stored in and may operate on a blockchain. And I like to think of a blockchain often as like a big operating system that's distributed on multiple nodes. It happens to be a transaction in software that executes, but I think that the interesting part that we're here to talk about is that in addition to it being a software transaction that's executing, we're also building more of just the parameters around that contract, including some basic contract language in the traditional sense, into that same code, in the same transaction, where not only a computer can understand what the transactions are, but where all the participants, including perhaps lawyers, can understand it.
I'll just add actually two things. The terminology is evolving. And I remember when we met with Mark, a year and a half ago.
Almost 2 years ago.
Almost 2 years. We went from Bitcoin to distributed ledger to, I've heard the term distributed infrastructure to distributed, and now there's smart contracts. And personally, I think that a lot of it is still evolving. A lot of it is sometimes used interchangeably, and it's going to continue to evolve. So I personally don't stick to, or don't get picky about terminology. The thing about smart contracts in my mind is that it goes across a spectrum. There is the digital code representation of a traditional contract that may still exist, and then on the other end of the spectrum is where the code is the contract, and I think that we're still at this end of the spectrum, at least from what I've seen in the securities world, and we may move slowly to the other side of the spectrum. But there's a whole variety of possibilities there. It's also similar to when we hear about digital assets or tokenized assets. We've heard issuing securities on the ledger, on the distributed ledger, and then we've heard digital representation of securities that are issued traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
Sandra, do you want to take the other half of that question, which is how smart contracts fit into the DLT landscape from your perspective?
From our perspective, obviously we are experimenting and looking at lots of different potential use cases. I think the full extent of what is possible with smart contracts is yet to be realized, and I'm not going to sit here on the stage and tell you that we've got the answers to exactly how this is going to work out. But I think there's a lot of promise, which is why there's so much attention and money and effort and collaboration happening. We are, as a regulated entity, however, very cognizant about the fact that we need to operate, unlike others who are out there, we need to operate under a regulatory and legal framework across 160 different countries or places where we touch customers. And if that's the case, that means we need to understand that when we put something new out there, that we better be sure that we've worked with the right legal and regulatory bodies to make that happen. It's not done in a vacuum or siloed.
So can we sort of, again, staying at a very high level at the moment before we start talking about some of the legal issues, would anyone like to talk about the technical or operational challenges with using smart contracts?
There were two conversations last week where towards the end of it, I realized what they were talking about was actually smart contracts. The first one was
a smart conversation.
I know. So towards the end of it, when I asked the industry folks, "Is this a smart contract?" Nobody wanted to use the term, but at least so we look at it sort of functional approach. So from the universe we live in, derivatives markets, especially the over-the-counter world, and sort of the previous speakers have sort of spoken about it. And there are also operational issues that the industry is dealing with. And the promise is this technology might actually help deal with overcome the sort of the operational challenges that the firms have. The first example from last week was this firm called Ubixi, and they're actually doing a prototype with the CME group, wherein the firms have operational challenges in terms of exchanging payments. So you have a customer does a trade, say on CME Group, the customer has to post initial margin to the FCM, and the FCM has to post initial margin to the clearinghouse, and so on and so forth. And there are also operational issues, and so there's like a permission private ledger essentially, which has been created, which is in the process of being created to facilitate payments in with as little inefficiency as possible. But the binding constraint for that is people have realized that you have these operational challenges for a long time, but firms were not willing to make the investment. But the binding constraint these days in the world we live in, or at least I spend a lot of time worrying about, is capital costs. Capital costs have become really high because of new regulations, so the firms are willing to make investments in terms of new technologies to economize to sort of on the capital cost. And the second example that I came across last week was this firm called Acadia Soft. Starting September 15th of this year, our rules require that if you trade bilateral, uncleared, over-the-counter swaps, you need to post initial margin. And the initial rule set applies to the largest firms, the largest banks. And come, I think, March 15th, a larger subset of market participants have to be subject to those rules. Once again, all sorts of operational challenges in terms of making the payments. And Acadia Soft is a utility which ISDA, which is an industry consortium, a trade association, has sort of pulled together for firms to be able to exchange the right amount of information. They don't want to share all the information about the trades. So let's assume I'm Goldman Sachs and you're Morgan Stanley, you've done a bunch of trades, we need to exchange initial margin. We have operational challenges in exchanging all the information. At the same time, I don't want to show all my trades to my competitor, who's also my counterparty. So Acadia Soft has essentially come up with what I look at as a distributed ledger, wherein all the information resides, plus a bunch of analytics, and also compliance with rules and regulations, so that firms can actually figure out how much initial margin do I need to sort of post with the other firm.
Okay, Dax, I'd like to ask you a question. When you are thinking about smart contracts, we've heard that there's a sort of a spectrum. Kavita described a spectrum of possible models of smart contracts. When you're thinking about smart contracts and different models of smart contracts, what are the legal issues that you think about in relation to them?
Well, I mean, the first question I ask is, well, is this extra legal, or is it operating within some sort of legal environment? And I guess I thought it was interesting that today in the two PowerPoint presentations we've had so far, there were pictures and some discussion of vending machines. Nick and then Jain both had a vending machine as an example there. And interestingly, a year ago, Professor Larry Lessig, who you may know is a professor who's talked about code and law, gave a presentation at the Koala blockchain workshops in Sydney that's worth watching. But he also had a vending machine, an old-fashioned vending machine in his presentation. And it was the same old-fashioned kind. You put in a dime and you get a quarter, or you get a Coke. And the observations he made is that the vending machine does execute a transaction. It's a transaction where I'm trying to buy a Coke, but it also operates in a legal environment where if the Coke doesn't come out, there's a breach of implied contract. If the Coke that comes out has been poisoned, then there are products liability laws that will protect the consumer. And he went on with a number of other potential legal issues. And so, to me, I think it is important. I mean, I think that the concept smart contract has gotten us probably a little bit more confused than we need to be. In my view, smart contracts are transactions that are increasingly more sophisticated because of the power of the technology behind them and the ability to embed logic and rules into them. But they will always operate within some sort of legal construct. And Larry Lessig also argued that we want that. And this goes to kind of your operational question too, that it's both a blessing and a curse to have something that always executes automatically with rigidity, and that the law is there oftentimes to fill in, to gap fill, that you want some ambiguity and you want some sort of some sort of construct in which to arbitrate disputes. And so I guess legal issues, the first one I ask is, well, is it a contract? And if it is, and I think that the short answer is, it is part of a contract, but it's not all of the contract. And there are network rules, there are operating rules of systems, there are contracts or terms and conditions. And the real question is, I think for the industry, is how can we improve on what we have today with this better technology, right? That I think we can swap out a lot of different pieces. I think in the white paper that you look at, one of the commonalities of like all the use cases is that we've taken parties out of the mix. Sometimes we put new ones in. We're doing the same thing with contract law, with legal resolution, with mediation, and so the real question is, can we, given the power of the technology, can we take some of the law out, and which pieces do we need? And I happen to be of the view that we're going to always want the law to be an environment in which we can undo things. Like, for instance, the DAO that Mark brought up, executed arguably the way it was coded to work, okay? But we didn't like the result. And it was unfair and unjust. So in the court of equity, we rolled it back, right? That we got ahead of ourselves. But it is something where there are questions about, was that a general partnership? Was it what sort of legal entity was it? What were the terms under which it operated? And that while I think that we can automate and distribute, we don't need as many bilateral arrangements. Sometimes they're quite useful.
Sandra, would you like to, Mark in the earlier session made an interesting comment, which was that smart contracts for financial services shouldn't run on public DLTs. You can answer that question or respond to that if you like, but can you also just talk about, when you're thinking about how smart contracts solutions might work, the kind of questions that you might have around governance of the overall environment in which they're operating?
So I'll take the first one, which is actually, I would argue, it's about the confidentiality and the privacy that you need to make sure that certain transactions are not available to everyone. So when a public blockchain is able to solve those problems, there will be no issue with using a public blockchain, and in many ways you could make the argument that it would be more secure because you've got an entire global network securing that entire ecosystem. However, we are not there yet. So therefore, I completely agree. For now, if you're going to build on technology, it does need to be private and permissioned for it to really thrive, at least in the short term. right?
And just to be a little bit controversial here,
Yes, let's do
I think we're
controversy.
close. I read the Chain white
Yeah, I'm
paper.
squirming in my chair as you.
I read the Chain white paper on the plane coming out here, and I think they have a solution where this is meant to be a public blockchain where the data is also hidden, right? That there are some very smart people who are building also on the Ethereum platform that have found a way for public and private transactions to exist on a public blockchain using different application layers, I think. And so I actually think that we're probably closer than...
Time frame?
Yeah.
Well,
Time frame?
Sooner than later?
Well, this is where I defer to the technologists in the audience, but I actually think that we have beta versions of solutions that solve that problem right now, and that they're in proof of concept.
Do those solve governance problems too?
Well, which governance problems are we asking about?
Well, I mean, so as regulators, obviously we worry about regulated entities, financial institutions, operating on a trustless environment where you don't know what parties people may be interacting with. They could be parties on the sanctioned list, they could be parties from foreign countries. So the question that comes to mind when people say public blockchains is really around governance. Who is responsible for the kind of the terms of engagement? Who is responsible for conflict resolution, dispute resolution? Who is responsible for ensuring that all parties are doing what they say they're supposed to do? And I mean, look, that's been evidenced in the Bitcoin blockchain. There have been, disagreements about how to expand capacity. It was evidenced in the Ethereum blockchain with the DAO and, how that hack should be resolved. And those things make me very uneasy to think that large amounts of financial transactions could possibly operate on a public blockchain.
So I have an answer, but I think, Sandra, you said you wanted to. Did you say you had a comment?
No, go ahead, please.
Well, so I think the more you experiment with these different technologies, the more comfortable people get. I've watched regulators get more comfortable with it the more they've understood it. And the idea that it's a public blockchain does frighten people, right? But you have to break that down into its components, right? That what we're often talking about is that this is shared ledger technology that's run on nodes all around the world, and you have this concept of either permission nodes or non-permission nodes, like the Bitcoin blockchain. Anybody can download that software off to GitHub, download the software, run it, and as I understand, 70% of the Bitcoin transactions are being mined or run in China, for instance, right? And that can shift all around the world and has geopolitical implications. And then there are permissioned ledgers where the nodes are more of this intranet model that I think Jeff was alluding to earlier, where it's very, very few parties, known parties, that are running it. I like to joke that regulators love decentralization as long as it's centralized. That we make it what we know. And for me, what I've come to realize is that often, even in a public blockchain, what's being lodged there is like a hash. It's like a hash of something. If you trust encryption, it can be a hash. The data is often itself not stored. Like there's line items like with Swift, you can put notes, but the real information about the contract or dollar amounts is kept on systems outside of the public blockchain. And so I think there's a way to split this concept of permission versus unpermission versus full access to the data that's published on the blockchain, and there's levels of permission that attach to your keys, where some party can read and write more information than others can, and we have the beauty of computer science at our disposal, in addition to blockchain, to build different permissioned accesses. Sandra looks like she wants to spar a little bit.
No. Actually, I want to make a point and pivot just slightly, if that's okay, Sean.
Sure.
About governance, actually.
Yep.
So when we think about how smart contracts are going to be used, there's actually, it's not about does it work and will it be automated. It's more, what happens when something goes wrong?
Yeah.
So CME is a risk manager. Okay, that's what we do. We're a marketplace, and we have many different roles and responsibilities, which is we're a referee. We offer, we do our best to offer a very even playing field for as a marketplace for participants to come. We also do surveillance. We do all sorts of things, and we also do financial security in the sense that if something goes wrong, we will cover you. And that security is a very unique thing in the sense of, in a smart contract world, in a decentralized world, who is responsible when things go wrong? And who's going to pay out when things go wrong? Because people will never complain when they're making money, but when there are massive losses, guess what? It's only human nature. They want somebody to blame. So who is that?
So I'm going to pick up.
And where's the governance on that?
Do you want to respond?
Well, I should try to answer that. Well, and I guess it's important to. Go ahead.
Two points. One is just in the larger context of the technology. The larger context of the technology, the regulatory space. If you sort of look at the Financial Stability Oversight Council's annual report, cybersecurity is a big issue. If you ask me what keeps me up at night, cybersecurity is a thing which security is still a big issue. So I don't know what's the state of the technology to sort of support transactions in markets that we regulate, I guess. And then we're talking about the Dow case. There's this equivalent in the market space, both the cash market and the derivatives markets, where people are trading, something happens, either typically isn't fraud, it tends to be an operational issue, and trades need to be annulled, right? So there is this thing called error correction policy. So there tends to be rules and procedures in terms of how to handle these things. And if you want to roll back the trades, then how do we do it? And I know that it's a non-trivial issue, even in markets that are very regulated. And you go outside that space into sort of some of the other aspects of the financial system. It's all sorts of challenges come up in terms of being able to sort of roll back and reverse transactions that have happened.
Well, to the question of who's responsible, who bears the risk, right? I mean, I think it's interesting to note in the context of the Dow that was one application that was running on the Ethereum network, right, or the Ethereum protocol. It was not Ethereum, and so there's somebody that was behind the Dow. Promoters, and they and again my comment about general partnerships, everyone who participated in the Dow, could potentially be viewed as promoters of a general partnership, and anyone is potentially liable, right? There are multiple ways that you could get to and solve those questions. We haven't yet. We haven't had a need to because we rolled it back. We had a private bailout, which I think is great because we're in pre-beta mode here. Still kicking tires on all of this, but. I haven't seen yet a vulnerability in Bitcoin or in Ethereum that has not been addressed. In fact, I sat through a presentation by one of the known security experts, this is now 3 years ago, who said he was looking for a problem with Bitcoin. And everyone he thought he could find, he found a solution for. That because of this concept of decentralization and distributing it, where everybody's invested in that software, making sure it's running because of their interest, that they solve those problems. So there will still be, and this is kind of the question about contracts, right? That if you're running an application or you're selling a mortgage or you're doing a derivative transaction, then the parties who are behind that are responsible. And in my view is also that these transactions will happen in some sort of a portal environment where parties will say, yes, I want to participate, and here's the rules, and here's how we're going to resolve disputes. And it's going to be very much what we're used to today.
So it goes back to rules and protocols, right? So I recall when the financial markets transitioned from flow-based trading to electronic trading, moved actually to a network. They were all used to trade on the pit, and then it went to the network. And over the years, I've seen the rules always lag the market participants. So without commenting on it, if you read the book Flash Boy, it's all about claims being made about how rules are being gamed by certain market participants. So when I think about the distributed ledger and a blockchain and all sorts of interesting things, I always go back to the familiar thing, which is the transition in the markets from flow to electronic trading. And it's a full employment guarantee for regulators. And for people who are writing rules, because you'll never get the rules right the first time. And there'll be incentive, if there's money to be made, people are going to be incentivized to game the rules. So it's a given that, so when people say the rules will be perfect, they'll never be perfect, okay? And so, which goes to my basic point that there will be a role for the regulators, though there's this belief that distributed ledger and the code is law. When you read some of the thoughts in there, that can you actually minimize the role of the regulator? My sense is that the regulatory institutions are just going to be spending more time on this stuff, and because the inherent nature of the network is such that, and the fact that you need to have rules and protocols, we won't get it right. And firms are going to be incentivized to sort of keep gaming them. I don't know how we get around that problem.
Well, I mean, to me, there's this concept of discretion. There's discretion and ambiguity. Two key words to keep in mind when we're talking about smart contracts, right? And I think what we're saying is that for certain types of automatable, simple transactions, we want them just to execute, and we don't want a lot of discretion, right? And so if it is a set environment where it's easy, it just happens, and we don't have to have a lot of human intervention, that actually creates the opportunity for fewer errors, right? And the real question for me is finding the use cases where you want automation and you don't need discretion, right? And so that's why it's like smart contracts are for dumb applications, right? Those are the best ones to begin with. But we will get more sophisticated with this, and I think part of it's incumbent on all of us to figure out what is the right structure, both technical, legal, you name it, normative, to handle this paradigm shift that we're dealing with. Right? I mean, we're here meeting because something has happened, and standard contracts don't handle it well enough. Standard code by itself isn't adequate, right? So we're kind of grappling with the same things that Larry Lessig described in 1996 about, the law impacts this to some extent, norms do, markets do, and architecture like code and software and systems developments do, right? And it's this whole package of things we're trying to sort out.
I had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Just in response to Dax and Sandra about security. Dax, I echo a lot of what you said about how we shouldn't underestimate that these technologies are fundamentally secure. And on the flip side, if you look at something like the DAO, it's important to remember that the DAO is separate from Ethereum. I'm a huge fan of these technologies. But if you look at the subsequent split of Ethereum into two coins, a little fork, I mean, not to get too technical about it, but I can understand why somebody who's a risk manager or a regulator might look at that and worry about what would happen if the economy was running.
Including all sorts of things, including systemic risk, right? And if we're automating and we have interoperability and we're running everything on an automated basis across, then if it does fail, and if there's a low probability of failing, but if it does fail, it's catastrophic, right?
Which is why I think that the governance, and I keep going back to the same thing, is governance structure is so important, which is why I think in a permissioned environment, all parties are agreeing upon a certain governance structure, certain resolution if something like that were to happen. Yeah. Whereas in just picking on the same DAO incident again, there was disagreement amongst participants as to how that issue should be resolved.
And the irony is it actually created the double spend problem. Actually, by forking during Classic, now some people actually cashed out and double their money.
So if you're not an FX markets watcher, you're not going to necessarily know what happened. And I think about this particular episode in terms of if we had smart contracts that ran the markets, what would have happened. So you may recall back in January of, I think the year before, the Swiss National Bank decided to remove the floor on
Jan
Euro
15th.
Swiss. Thank you very much. And it was not a good day if you were in the FX markets because one, I think 4 days before, one of the central bankers from the SNB had actually indicated publicly that they were keeping the floor. What was it, 121, 120? Thereabouts. Well, markets like to know and be assured of certain things, right? Markets don't like big surprises. Well, the floor was literally ripped out that morning, 4 days later, and wreaked havoc on the market. So if you were running contracts that were just self-executing, pulling in feeds from Euro Swiss, your contracts would have gone nuts and your mark-to-market would have been a mess because on one of the biggest liquidity providers on the day, and this was something we got through talking to a lot of people on the street, 36 liquidity providers were providing market-making pricing for this one platform. 36. Do you know how many pulled out the minute this happened? 34. There were 2 market makers in that market with spreads so wide that it was you could drive a truck through it. The point being is there are situations that you just can't account for. Those are your black swan tail, really fat tail situations, but they happen. When they happen, they're catastrophic in the sense that a couple companies actually went under. I know of a number of hedge funds that went under that day, literally because there was an action taken that no one in the market could have prepared for. So, therefore, for me, when I think about smart contracts, I think it's brilliant. I think the potential is amazing. But my question is how do we resolve situations and how do we either code or have governance around situations that when things go berserk?
Well, and what I've heard from very smart people, many of whom are in this room, that they've recognized that immutability can be separated from automatability, right? And that we often don't necessarily want to set a contract today that's going to execute 5 years in the future without the ability to amend it, right? But we can create different versions and states of contracts that get amended. That we agree, I want to do an FX transaction today, but have the ability with my contract partner to change that contract on the fly without a lot of discussion, frankly, right? To be able to automate now a revocation of that contract if both parties agree. But there's things like efficient breach where people want to go through with the transaction, some of them don't, and we're going to have to work through these same sort of offer and acceptance and amendment modification issues that we have in real life, and we're going to have problems, Sandra, right? There's going to be situations where people lose money because they've experimented in a transaction like this, but also situations where they made a lot of money because they were able to automate it and move it forward without having to have discretion or get their partner to agree to a contract they're faxing over, waiting for the fax to clear.
When people come and talk to us about these concepts and the innovation that's happening, a lot of it sounds like a pie in the sky type stuff. But the conversation gets really interesting when there's a well-identified problem and there's a solution that somebody is trying to work towards. At least I think we were chatting, Kavita and myself, the other day that a lot of these solutions that we see seem like solution looking for problems, I guess. But the questions about whether it's a permissioned or it's a public ledger, I think those issues go away when there's a well-defined issue that you're trying to resolve, and then figure out whatever is the right technological approach to sort of solve it, I guess.
Okay, so we've got one question over here.
This is for Mr. Hansen. As an attorney, I'm curious when some of the issues are what's the resolution, how are we going to resolve it? I mean, typically in standard contracts, you say, okay, I'm going to agree to arbitration through, random, whatever the arbitration law that you want to use, or if you want to use ICC judgments, that's what you're going to refer to. Why is that not applicable here, or is it applicable here? And then if something isn't written in regards to what law you're going to use, if it's California state law or whatever, can you use the typical notion in regular contract law of understanding like what jurisdiction you're going to go to and what law, just like if that wasn't included in a standard contract, you would then figure out what law is applicable.
Mm-hmm. So my personal view is it's going to be very similar, right? My hope is that we take some of those out, some of those decisions we've had to make, and we're able to automate this. But I think that there are two schools of thinking here, which is we don't need the law, we don't need the courts, we don't need the lawyers. We know what the transaction is, we're just going to make it happen. But there's also one where we wonder about these issues of dispute resolution and where and how do I get my money back and is it insured? And so my view is that there will be a wrapper around a smart contract model, that there will be contracts that get standardized for simple transactions where a lot of it's baked in and it's better than it is today. It's automated to digital, and there will also be a wrapper where I imagine that people will be going into a portal to decide that, yes, I want to engage in smart contract transactions for these types of transactions. Here's the rules, your T's and C's. You maybe incorporate a rule book that also gets adopted, or some equivalent of like the Uniform Commercial Code that is a gap filler, right? Like that if today you sign a smart contract and there were no terms, you're going to, in the United States at least, the UCC will gap fill and fill in all of those details. And so we have a decision to make. Do we want the UCC or do we want something else?
There's a question right over there, right at the end.
Okay, I'll address this to the regulators, I guess. My question is, I think judging from the panel so far, we are assuming regulators are perfect, which is not true. So at what point, at what point is it human error versus technical error? I think that's the important thing to track. Like, are we designing these systems to be able to identify the source of the error rather than the blaming situation, which could, go either direction? And then second, are regulators ready to sort of evolve their role given this new reality?
So regulations are not written in a vacuum, right? So we have a statute which requires us to write certain rules. So we had Dodd-Frank, which is an act of Congress saying that regulators need to go and write a whole bunch of rules that is going to be addressing certain activities in the markets. So we take our guidance from the statute, and then there's a debate on whether it should be principles-based or whether it's going to be sort of something much more prescriptive, and there's always this debate that goes on, I guess. It's interesting I speak to most of the regulators within the DC area, and we all are really interested in this technology. Just last week, I was in a meeting with one of the governors of the Board of Governors of the Fed, who I know is really interested in these issues. So I'm happy to report there's a fair amount of information sharing and discussions that happen among sort of senior regulatory authorities, especially the financial market space. And what we tell people when they come and talk to us is, tell us if you want to innovate in the derivatives markets, are there any specific rules that either the statute or whether the CFTC has in its books, which might be hindering you from making innovations, right? And I find the same refrain coming from the board, from the SEC, from FINRA, and others. People really want to know. And you're right, regulations, I've worked on enough rulemaking to know that we'll always get it wrong. At least in the margin, it's an imperfect process, an evolutionary process.
Sorry to interrupt, Sayee, but what I will add is that I think the spirit of the rule stays. Yep. Sometimes we get the technicalities yep. wrong. So, for something that required a fax 50 years ago, we're not going to require firms to fax reports to us in today's day and age. But the spirit of the rule still stays. So I echo Sayee's comments that we've been engaging with the industry for almost 2 years now to learn about what's happening in this space. We, at FINRA, we've received a handful of applications that have given us the opportunity to engage in dialogue with those applicants to really help them navigate kind of the regulatory landscape in the securities industry. But at the same time, we can't be their outsourced legal compliance counsel, because that would then definitely be a full-time employment act. So I just want to, in response to your question, say that regulators in DC, in the securities industry specifically, are actively engaged with the industry, are trying to stay ahead of the curve, but we can't come up with new regulations or new rules or modify existing ones until unless we understand that the existing ones really are serving to be an obstacle.
I was going to say, we've probably got what time for one last question.
Kavita, one of the things I think that's interesting is you talked about sort of the overarching aspects, and I think today a lot of the conversation is talked about smart contracts in a very simplistic way, like an executable program. But the problem is there's a lot of triggers and monitoring that are going to have to be in place to actually trigger nested contracts. And how do you wrap all that? I haven't heard anything about that.
Yeah, and I'll just, again, not to sound like I'm being the skeptic in this space, but just to that point, there are questions around, the alarm bells ring off in my head, where does the data come in to invoke those triggers? Are those reliable data sources? What if the data source, gets corrupt or isn't intentionally manipulated to invoke a certain trigger? So I don't know, Dax, if you have any thoughts.
Well, I guess I'll say that yes. So now we've created a new burden on an oracle, right? I mean, whereas it was fine to just reference the Wall Street Journal, now we actually are going to impose a fiduciary duty, if you will, and an insured liability on an oracle who's giving us data feeds upon which we're basing these transactions. I think it's important to give a shout out, acknowledgement to both the SEC and to the OCC, and I think the CFPB and the CFTC and others. But there have been announcements in the last couple months, and just even the last couple weeks, about innovation. The SEC had their innovation forum. The OCC announced a fintech charter, right? That I think what we're seeing is that there's a willingness, my perception is a willingness on the part of the regulators to engage and try to understand, and they recognize that we're moving faster than dog years. This is way faster than dog years. And how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way where you get some certainty? One can argue that, like with the Bitfinex order, the market, one of the regulated entities made some responses around how you hold Bitcoin, how you hold keys, the key structure, where you're getting kind of development of law through enforcements and orders. And so regulators, I think, need to understand the sway they have over regulated entities, that they only want to move when they've got the acknowledgement and consent of their regulator in an area where the technology is moving so rapidly that it's a real challenge to stay informed.
I'm going to stick my nose in real quick and say there's no asymmetry in this. There's automation to do something, but there's also automation to restrict behavior. And this is the best tool that a regulator could ever embrace. You can code a smart contract or smart security to prevent it from doing something that's against compliant rules. Mm-hmm. So for example, I have shares I can't transfer until a 144 or 144 is filed. If I attempt to transfer them today, I can probably do that and get away with it. If it's enforceable in a smart contract that lives exclusively on a distributed ledger, with those rules, it will not happen. So there's the whole other side of this discussion that wasn't even breached. That is the value for the people sitting up there. That's the genius. That's the beauty. So you had an immutable ledger with the most pure audit trail in history, and you restrict movements based on rules and regulation. You've got exactly the state you're looking for. It's not intrusive, and it puts you on the same side of the table as those you regulate instead of in an adverse relationship.
And Mark, you didn't get to describe the initiative that Delaware is working on, I know you're involved in, where the question was, how do you take public records and expunge them? The law requires you to do it. It sits on all sorts of databases, and it's hard to pull that out. In fact, I think most of the states are not following their public records laws. Delaware has built into the code around the data the automatic deletion of data. You can see that you can prevent and require certain actions as we automate it. And to me, that's the real blessing and opportunity of smart contracts and blockchain distributed ledger technology.
No, and I agree. So, you're right. We didn't get an opportunity to talk about the benefits that the technology offers to regulators. I mean, real-time market transparency. Regulators are salivating at that.
And so are those who are regulated, by the way. No one wants to call to have your conference room open for a month when 7 people are going to come in and look at files A through Z, right? And give me 3 of your people with spreadsheets and HP 12Cs to punch numbers all day long.
Right, and we don't want to have to worry about, are these reports fabricated?
Exactly.
Are they up to date? Are they all, from the same timestamp? And do they reconcile with what the counterparties are saying? So I totally agree with you.
But to answer the gentleman's question about nested contracts and why we haven't even touched this topic, I think you can tell by the topic itself today for the last hour or whatever we've spent, we're at basics here. We haven't worked out some of the more fundamentals of how smart contracts are going to work, let alone talk about how complex processes or even the next level up would work, because we don't even have the building blocks yet established. So I think it's a longer term road. I know, Dex, you feel differently. Maybe it's sooner, maybe it'll happen sooner. But I think what needs to happen is we need to have the technology lined up with regulation, and that's global regulation as well as the legal framework. And that's going to take some time. Tech will always be ahead, and I think that's great. Tech should just kind of push ahead and do what it needs to do. But financial institutions like ours really need to marry as many of those 3 components together to make it work, because otherwise it's going to be a difficult thing for us to adopt.
And there's other thing which I've told in sort of other similar discussions with industry is I encourage the industry to think of how to make the regulator and the sort of government authorities early adopters of the technology. I've seen a lot of discussions and PowerPoint presentations of use cases where they show the distributed ledger and there's a node, they say that's the regulatory node.
We're waiting to see that.
Absolutely. And I have an open offer to firms saying, it's like, if you like to come and discuss with us, just sort of do some blue sky thinking in terms of, how will the regulatory node function? What will we do? Because if, for instance, if the futures markets transitions to a distributed ledger, our role the way we do business today has to change fundamentally. We really don't know how it's going to change, but if the industry is interested in having the conversation with us today, we're happy to sort of do it. It's much more interesting than talking about rules and regulations.
Okay, so on that challenge to the industry, I'm going to have to draw a line. As you can see, there's an awful lot we could have talked about. We could have definitely gone on for another few hours here. If anyone's interested in legal and regulatory topics, at the back of the white paper, there's a chapter on legal and regulatory issues. I commend that to you. But I'd just like to end by thanking our fantastic panels for a great discussion. Thank you. Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, so we're getting into the tail end of the day here. We are just about to hear Microsoft's special announcement, and we need to make a special acknowledgement here today. In this white paper, there's the anatomy of a smart contract, and maybe apropos for how we all got here, maybe it's the provenance of this special gathering. The Smart Contracts Symposium is part of the Smart Contracts Alliance. How does the Smart Contract Alliance form? Guys like Mark, guys like Sean get together and say, hey, Perianne, we have this mandate. We want to uplift a particular technology, a standard, a regulatory friction point. And the industry gets together and does this organically. It's really special to watch. And so, but when you look at everything that took place here, from the people to the printing to the hors d'oeuvres you're about to have, it takes a team. And that team is led by an extraordinary leader in Perianne. So Perianne, great job today, and please join me in giving a big round of applause. And as you see with Rumi's appointment and the rest of the advisory board, Perianne surrounds herself with an amazing team. Also with the Chambers team here today, we have, where's Dan Spooler? Dan, awesome. Let's applaud for everybody. Marie is here. Parth, Aditi, Chase, just an amazing team. So let's, anybody else I'm missing? And Jason, of course, Jason. Yeah. So I just, let's give another round of applause for the Chamber team. Thank you. Okay, last but certainly not least, we have Craig with Microsoft that's going to come on stage and give Microsoft's special announcement. Craig?
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, due to kind of a family emergency, York, who was going to make the announcement today, is unable to be here. And since he's got so much of the detail around kind of what we've been doing, I think we're not going to do that full announcement like we originally anticipated. We will be announcing things on our blog shortly on the Azure blog. But basically what we will be talking about, what you will see us discuss, is our project manifest. And it's a way that we're trying to do good by helping suppliers be much more clear about the provenance of their goods and services as it moves through the supply chain. Now, unfortunately, again, because York had an emergency where he was unable to be here tonight, and he has all that detail, I'm unable to kind of cover it the way we would love to. But we thank you very much for coming today. We thank you very much for kind of your attention. Do watch the Azure blog for the announcement. It will be out shortly, and we'll cover in a lot more detail exactly how we accomplished it. We're very proud of the work, and we look forward to your feedback and continuing the dialogue as we go forward.
Thank you, Craig. And in classic Microsoft style, building the suspense and keeping us on our toes. York has been very active in the Smart Contracts Alliance. He's the whole reason why we were able to use this space today. I want to give a couple shout outs and a couple thanks. First and foremost to our title sponsor, Deloitte, who is the title sponsor of the event, but also partnered with us to get this white paper published and out today. Also want to thank the sponsors from today, including Block, Jain, IBM, Perkins Coie, Symbiont, our host, Microsoft, and our media partner, Distributed. You guys all have a copy of Why Bitcoin Magazine on your seats. Those were courtesy of Distributed. And of course, I want to thank the Smart Contracts Alliance for helping pull this entire event together. I want to thank our speakers, our members, our prospective members. I know many of you have asked me about, how do I join the chamber? How do I be a part of this? We're very humbled by that and honored by that. And I just want to reiterate that the Chamber's platform, this is an industry platform to scale and build this industry. So if you're interested in the work that we're doing at the Chamber, you want to participate in the Smart Contracts Alliance. If you're investing and innovating in blockchain-based technologies, including smart contracts, join us and talk to myself, talk to my team. Jason is here, Dan is here, Chase, Parth, Aditi. I want to thank all of them, and Marie, who will all be out here at the cocktail reception following this event. I also want to wish everyone a safe and a happy holiday season. And I don't want to hold us back anymore. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again. And please join us for the reception right out these two doors.